and which kind of language. They used to call that is Afro-Asiatic language. But there is no such thing like Afro-Asiatic family, because it's almost impossible to put together in the same family Semite language like Akkadian, Hebrew, Phoenician, Arabic, and then Berber and Kushat language and Egyptian language in the same family. Nobody can succeed. It's impossible to do that. When they do that, just pure ideology. There is no scientific fact, you see. So we remove the language, Kemet, Egyptian language, from this fake family called Afro-Asiatic family in the United States, called also in France, basically they call that Kamito-Semitic family. There was no such thing like that.
They argue that the Egyptian language was completely different from the languages spoken in West, Central, or East Africa. But this debate has been ongoing since 1844, when a German scholar, without any proof, proposed this division. And because it was written by a German, it was accepted without question, even though the argument was overly complicated and frankly false. Later, they stopped calling it the Hamitic language family, and an American scholar, Grimberg, suggested the term Afro-Asiatic languages. These are languages spoken in Africa, like Berber and Ancient Egyptian, as well as languages spoken in Asia, like Semitic languages, Hebrew, Babylonian, etc. The Americans accepted this without question due to their cultural and scientific influence. But the reality is, many of those who describe African languages aren't real linguists. They're simply language describers. I've had the privilege of studying real linguistics, and I learned the difference. At a major conference in Barcelona, I was confronted by a linguist from Los Angeles who worked with computers. He ran a program that compared 1,000 words from Egyptian with 1,000 words from Semitic languages and asked the computer to find common roots. The computer did the work and left many blank spaces where there were no matches. When he presented his findings, I said, "I can do better than your computer. I'll fill in those blanks." And when I did, it became clear that the computer was right to leave those spaces blank because the languages didn't match. But they insisted on creating this Afro-Asiatic category, even when the evidence didn't support it. This entire debate is ideological. The facts show that ancient Egypt was part of Africa, that its people were black, and that the connections between Egypt and other African cultures are much stronger than some scholars are willing to admit. And actually, I'm saying this now politely because I was even embarrassed. After all, he was a scholar, a colleague, and I couldn't go too far with my remarks. I was embarrassed, so I stopped. When we went out for drinks that evening, he said, "You're awful." I replied, "No, it's you who's awful, Afro-Asiatic." He was trying to make a joke with the term Afro-Asiatic. I told him, "You're the one who's awful because you need to abandon this Afro-Asiatic theory." Early ancestors in Africa began shaping simple sounds into meaning. They imitated nature, the crack of dry wood, the whisper of breath, a baby's cry. According to some researchers, 10 primordial sounds formed the seeds of language. Little syllables like kai, the sound of a breaking branch, or hu, a gust of breath. These humble sounds were onomatopoeic, meaning they mimicked what they described: a sniff, a cry, a distant call, and through them, speech was born in Africa. As families wandered and settled in different corners of the continent, their speech evolved into new tongues. Yet, deep within the words they spoke, they carried echoes of that ancient mother tongue, a common heritage waiting to be rediscovered. For thousands of years, African peoples passed down their history and wisdom through oral storytelling. Imagine communities gathered around a fire, listening to elders recount tales of ancestors in a language full of music and metaphor. Even as new languages blossomed and diverged, the storytellers' words often carried familiar sounds and meanings from one region to another. A greeting in a West African language might resemble a greeting in an East African one. A word for water or sun might sound strangely alike across vast distances. These similarities were no coincidence. They were like family resemblances between languages, clues that all these tongues were related at the roots. African oral tradition kept these clues alive. But for a long time, outsiders failed to hear the connections that African people had always sensed in their languages. As centuries passed, the languages of Africa became numerous and diverse. By some counts, over 2,000 languages are spoken on the continent. When European scholars began studying African languages in the colonial era, they marveled at this diversity. To make sense of it, linguists in the mid-1900s classified African languages into several separate families. One influential scholar, Joseph Greenberg, grouped them into 4 big families: Afro-Asiatic, which included North African and some Middle Eastern languages, like Ancient Egyptian and Arabic; Niger-Congo, the vast family that covers most of sub-Saharan Africa, including Bantu languages like Swahili and Zulu; Nilo-Saharan, languages of the Nile Valley and Saharan region; and Khoisan, certain click languages of southern Africa. On maps, Africa's linguistic landscape was painted in different colors for these families, as if they shared no common origin. In this map of Africa, showing the conventional language families, Afro-Asiatic in gold, Nilo-Saharan in purple, Niger-Congo in red, Khoisan in blue, etc. Traditional scholarship treated these as distinct groups with no single ancestor. This classification helped organize the study of African languages, but it also reinforced an old idea: that Africa was a Tower of Babel with languages going off in all directions, and that Ancient Egyptian, the language of the pharaohs, belonged with Asian languages rather than African ones. Some even used these linguistic divisions to argue that sub-Saharan African civilizations had no connection to the glory of ancient Egypt. Such claims fit a colonial narrative that separated Egypt from Black Africa. They suggested that high civilization, like Pharaonic Egypt, must have come from outside or was isolated, and that Black African societies were forever apart, speaking unrelated tongues. These assumptions, often tinged with racial bias, went unchallenged for years. But African scholars and leaders who grew up hearing the rhymes and rhythms shared across African languages carried a different understanding, and they were determined to prove it. Enter Cheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese historian with a bold vision. Diop had a profound intuition that Africa, despite its diversity, had a deep cultural and linguistic unity. In the 1960s and 70s, he argued that African peoples from the Mediterranean coast to the Cape of Good Hope are part of one extended family, and that this unity could be demonstrated in language, among other things. He proposed that Ancient Egyptian was not a distant cousin of African languages, but their elder sibling, or even their parent. To Diop, the Wolof language of his native Senegal, for example, did not descend from Ancient Egyptian, but Wolof and Ancient Egyptian both descended from an even older African mother tongue. He called this ancestral language Paleo-African, while others would later call it Negro-Egyptian or Negro-African. Diop's idea was radical. It meant that if you trace the family tree of languages far enough back in time, many of the languages spoken by Black Africans and Ancient Egyptian converge at a single root. In essence, he claimed one prehistoric language once gave birth to them all, just as Latin gave birth to French, Spanish, and Italian, and even further back as Latin itself came from an Indo-European mother tongue. This was a stunning claim, and to support it, Diop turned to linguistics, the science of language. He and others began comparing words and grammar across dozens of African languages and Ancient Egyptian. They looked for cognates, which are words in different languages that sound similar and have similar meanings, indicating they come from the same original word. What they found amazed them. Over 100 basic words appeared to be shared across numerous African languages from different families, like scattered pieces of an old puzzle. These were words for everyday concepts, body parts, family relations, elements of nature, the kind of core vocabulary that is least likely to be borrowed from one language to another. For instance, they pointed out similarities such as words for star, water, or child that recur in languages spoken thousands of miles apart. In one analysis, 101 common words were identified across African languages that Greenberg's classification would place in separate families. Finding the same words spanning the length and breadth of Africa suggested that these languages all inherited it from the same ancient source, rather than borrowing it later by chance. This was powerful evidence of an ancient linguistic kinship. One of Diop's close collaborators was Théophile Obenga, a linguist from the Republic of Congo. Together, they attended a historic symposium in Cairo in 1974, organized by UNESCO, where scholars gathered to discuss the origin of the ancient Egyptians and the relationship of Egypt to Africa. Diop and Obenga stood almost alone against a skeptical audience, determined to demonstrate that ancient Egypt was an African civilization, both ethnically and linguistically. Obenga took the lead in the linguistic argument. He systematically compared ancient Egyptian words and grammar with those of living African languages, such as Wolof, Fulani, Yoruba, and others. The results were striking. Egyptian shared far more similarities with these sub-Saharan African languages than it did with Semitic languages like Arabic or Hebrew. For example, he showed that certain grammatical structures in Egyptian, like how the plural is formed or how verb tenses work, were mirrored in tropical African languages, while the supposed relatives of Egyptian in the Afro-Asiatic family, like Semitic or Berber languages, were quite different. He also presented lists of Egyptian words alongside words in various African tongues, demonstrating parallel meanings and sounds. Bit by bit, they painted a picture of ancient Egyptian as one branch of a larger African language family, rather than an isolated language. Their work at that symposium astonished many. It was as if Egypt, which had been fenced off in scholarly minds as part of the Middle East, suddenly reunited with its African siblings. To describe this great language family connecting ancient Egyptian with the rest of Africa, Obenga adopted the term Negro-Egyptian. The name was meant to emphasize the inclusion of ancient Egyptian, the language of the Black Pharaohs, as well as the so-called Negro-African languages, an old term for sub-Saharan African languages. In Obenga's formulation, Negro-Egyptian was a vast macro-family encompassing many of the languages of Africa that had been split into separate groups before. It included ancient Egyptian and its later form, Coptic, the Niger-Congo languages, like Wolof, Igbo, Zulu, and hundreds of others, the Nilo-Saharan languages, spoken around the Nile and Central Africa, and even the Chadic and Cushitic languages of the Sahara and Horn of Africa. In other words, except for a few outliers like Berber and Khoisan, most African languages would belong to this single huge family. Obenga was essentially building upon Diop's Paleo-African concept and giving it a scholarly framework. He believed that just as Indo-European is recognized as the ancestor of a multitude of European and Indian languages, one could reconstruct a common ancestor for African languages, a Proto-African language that was the source of Negro-Egyptian. It would be possible, Obenga wrote, to identify a Negro-Egyptian language analogous to Indo-European. This idea was revolutionary. It positioned Africa as linguistically unified at a deep level, challenging the notion that African civilizations developed in isolation from one another. The task of actually reconstructing that ancient mother tongue, to breathe life into words that might have been spoken tens of thousands of years ago, was taken up by a new generation of African linguists inspired by Diop and Obenga. One such scholar is Jean-Claude Mboli from the Central African Republic, who in 2010 published a comprehensive study attempting to rebuild the Proto-Negro-Egyptian language. Using the rigorous comparative method, the standard scientific approach to historical linguistics, Mboli sifted through vocabulary and sounds of languages across Africa to infer what the ancestral language might have sounded like. His work suggested that the journey from the earliest human utterances to the languages we hear today was a long organic evolution, starting from the simple onomatopoeic syllables, which gradually formed words, then strings of words, and eventually complex sentences as human society advanced. Over millennia, as groups of people separated by rivers, forests, and deserts developed their own speech patterns. The single original tongue diversified into dialects, then into distinct languages, much like one river branching into many streams. But Mboli's reconstructions show common threads running through these languages, threads that can be uncovered by comparing them systematically. For instance, many Negro-Egyptian languages build new words by combining old roots, and they often repeat syllables for emphasis, as seen in words like titi or didi for intensification, features that can be traced back to early African speech. Bit by bit, these scholars are sketching the outlines of the first language that might have been spoken by Africa's early ancestors, the language from which the Negro-Egyptian family sprang. Beyond the technical details of phonology and grammar, why does the story of a unified African language family matter? It matters because language is more than just words. It carries culture, worldview, and identity. The discovery, or rather the rediscovery, of the Negro-Egyptian language family is also the reclaiming of a shared African heritage. It tells Africans and the world that the continent's people, from the Nile Valley to the Niger Delta, from the Congo rainforest to the Ethiopian highlands, are not as fragmented as colonial narratives would have us believe. Cheikh Anta Diop often emphasized that the cultural continuities across African societies outweighed their differences. He showed this in many ways, in religion, in art, in social organization. But language was one of the most persuasive. If the Wolof word for blood, or cow, or king had an analog in ancient Egyptian, and if a Bantu language in South Africa shared a root with a Berber tongue in the Sahara, it meant these peoples shared a story. Their languages were like different verses of the same ancient song. This realization fuels Pan-African ideals. It reinforces the sense that Africans, despite speaking over 2,000 languages today, belong to one family. In a practical sense, it encourages respect for each other's languages and traditions, knowing that at the most fundamental level, we are speaking variations of our ancestors' single language. There's also a powerful anti-colonial message in this narrative. During the colonial period, European scholars, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps by design, often downplayed connections among African civilizations. The result was a portrayal of Africa as a patchwork of tribes and tongues, forever apart, which made it easier to divide and rule. By scientifically demonstrating Africa's linguistic unity, African scholars challenged those old prejudices. As one modern writer noted, the very effort to link ancient Egypt to the rest of Africa was undertaken to disprove the prejudiced European claim that Egypt was not truly African. In essence, proving the Negro-Egyptian language family was part of reclaiming Egypt as an integral part of African history. It showed that the pharaohs spoke a language that has living cousins all over Africa, so the people of Africa can rightly see themselves as heirs to that great civilization. This has profound cultural significance. It restores a sense of pride and continuity. It says to a young African student, your language, be it Wolof or Yoruba or Swahili or Dinka, carries within it the wisdom of ages and links you to the builders of the pyramids and the sculptors of the Sphinx. Of course, the Negro-Egyptian hypothesis is not without controversy. Linguistics is a field that demands rigorous proof, and not all scholars are convinced that all African languages, minus a few exceptions, descend from one tongue. Some argue that the similarities could be due to ancient borrowings or sheer coincidence, and the debate continues in academic circles. But the narrative of Negro-Egyptian unity has already made a lasting impact. It has spurred new research and inspired many Africans to take up the study of their own language's history. Crucially, it shifted the center of linguistic research to Africa itself. For too long, Africans were the subjects of linguistic study, but not the authors. Diop, Obenga, Mboli, and others changed that. They demonstrated world-class scholarship, working across languages and disciplines to uncover truths about Africa's past. In doing so, they became heroes of a new African Renaissance, one that values science and history through an Afrocentric lens. And so, the story comes full circle, back to the voices in the African night. Picture this: a group of children sit under a great baobab tree as the sun sets. An elder begins to speak, telling a very old story about where their language came from. They don't use terms like comparative method or proto-language, but perhaps they say, "Long ago, all our people spoke as one." The children listen with wide eyes as the tale unfolds. How people traveled apart, but kept the same words in their hearts. How even the tongue of the ancients, who built mighty monuments by the Nile, is akin to the tongue we speak today. This tale is not a myth or a fantasy. It is what modern linguists are uncovering bit by bit. It is the real story of Africa's linguistic unity. A story written not in one book or by one author, but collectively by the languages themselves, carried in the minds and memories of millions of people. The Negro-Egyptian language family is the scholarly name for this story. But to the greater African audience, we might simply call it the story of Africa's family of languages. It's a beautiful reminder that despite the arbitrary borders and superficial differences, Africa has always been connected. The voices of Africa, whether speaking Swahili or Wolof, Amharic or Zulu, are variations on an ancient theme, and listening closely, we can hear in them the enduring chorus of a continent united by language and culture.